Looking at groups and identity. So the first part of the lecture is kind of around the self and identity, how we construe ourselves, but particularly in relation to others. And then the theme on groups, I'll focus particularly around race, because it's one of those things that's been studied quite extensively in this literature and obviously has lots of real-world importance. So what is a group? So obviously we think of a group as a collection of people, but psychologically a group is more than just that. So psychologically a group involves some either shared purpose or some interactions with each other and so on. So for instance, a group of people shopping in a supermarket aren't really a group in the psychological sense, but if they somehow have to work together for an emergency and so on, then they become a kind of a psychological group in the way that would meet these kinds of definitions about being interdependent, achieving a joint goal, but also these other ones which are harder to pin down. So just satisfying some need of joint association or belonging, this idea of affiliation that we kind of seek the company of others. We like cooperation. There's an intrinsic motivation to cooperate over and above kind of any material gains that we may get from that. It's just something that is kind of instinctive. And also kind of social rules and so on that define who or what constitutes a group. So again, we can define it in various ways, but the idea is there is something in one person's mind that enables them to see others as being like themselves. And to some extent, this is why the idea of identity and groups kind of go together. Because you might think thinking about yourself and thinking about others could be separate lectures, but actually you think about others in relation to yourself. Even if you're from individualistic cultures, this is part of your way of thinking. That's what a group is, but groups matter. So this is obviously a classic social psychology experiment in which you take two groups of people, I believe they were undergraduates, and they're assigned randomly into two groups. One are called prisoners, one are called guards, and they're given a set of rooms and scenarios in which to do this. But essentially they're not really given any instructions. But people effectively adopt different behaviours. They maltreat the prisoners and so on. And in this case, the experiment had to be terminated early because of the hostility of the wardens towards the prisoners and so on. So again, people kind of obey these kind of conventions. But again, it's not almost that they were acting out. There was an element in which you kind of cross a line between acting out and this being some kind of reality that they've kind of gone into here. But you kind of might imagine, well, this is all very good from a social psychology experiment, but how can you even get around this issue with neuroscience? Certainly you can't do anything like this in a kind of a clear, objective neuroscience way, doing fMRI, EEG, and so what's the equivalent? I think the key thing here for thinking about groups and identity from a social neuroscience point of view is really about the kind of mindset that people can get into. And this also applies for most social psychology experiments as well, in the sense that you can study individual minds and brains, which is obviously what social neuroscience is good at doing, but you can actually skew the context in terms of whether they're thinking about themselves as an individual or whether they're thinking about themselves as a group member. So this is what I mean by the context and the mindset. So you can still study individual minds and brains, but from the perspective of whether or not they are primed or cued to think of themselves as being white, British, whatever it might be, versus opposed to kind of self-needs and so on. So these kind of social context priming manipulations work on individual minds and brains and kind of offers a window in for methods of social neuroscience to explore these. And of course we can compare individual minds and brains across cultures and look at other forms of individual differences, whether it be genetic or whatever as well, within these kinds of paradigms. So it is possible to study groups and group behaviour via the study of individual minds and brains, but obviously there are compromises here as well that have to be had. So as I mentioned, I'll start off by talking about identity and self-concepts, both in terms of different kind of neural mechanisms, but also in terms of different kinds of mechanisms and how these might differ from from different cultures. I'll then talk about groups from two perspectives. One is kind of the favouritism for one's in-group, and the other is kind of out-group negativity. So again, whether or not these are two separate processes or in effect two sides of the same coin, that as soon as you favour one, you necessarily downgrade another, whether one's an inevitable consequence of the other or whether there are different factors that underplay each. So what about thinking about the self? So there's been a whole set of studies that suggest that this region of the brain, in what's called the medial prefrontal cortex, so if you imagine your brain and you've got your two hemispheres, you've got the inside bit where the two hemispheres are kind of almost abutting, but separated, that seems to respond when you're thinking about yourself and about certain others. So this is kind of one of the classic paradigms that's used, in which you're given a list of traits. So a trait would be kind of classic personality measured, so brave, honest, cheeky, whatever, extrovert. As it turns out, it doesn't really matter whether they're positive or negative traits. It's about thinking about your own personal kind of style, what makes you you. That seems to what matters. And here, again, obviously with all imaging experiments, it really does matter what the baseline is. So in this original experiment, they had two people. One would be somebody who's kind of known to you, a public celebrity or whatever, and asking them to make it a difference. But again, it doesn't really matter whether they're positive or negative traits. It does seem to be something about self-referential thinking. But also, what's interesting is that it's not exclusively the self. So although there is a distinction between self and other, there are other people who seem to activate this same region. So these are close others, and there's been a whole set of studies defining what constitutes a close other. People who are like you, people who you like, and so on, seem to activate there. So the red region here is your self-reference area, thinking about yourself. But thinking about the attitudes and behaviours of others who are deemed to be close to you also has this. So there's kind of been a whole debate in the literature about whether there really are any unique areas of the brain for just thinking about yourself. The answer seems to be probably not, but again, this seems to be kind of skewing the question in terms of what the self is. And obviously there's a long tradition of thinking of the self not just as an isolated individual, but the self in terms of a connectedness between others. So really asking the question, are there a unique set of brain regions just for the self, kind of predisposes that there is such a thing as the self that is separate from others anyway. And as soon as you break that down, you kind of find, well, the answer is no to both of those. There might not be something that defines the self uniquely, and certainly doesn't seem to be a unique neural correlate of this. So this has obviously triggered a whole kind of cottage industry as to what this part of the brain is doing. So it is involved in, for instance, other kind of classic tests like theory of mind and so on. But the idea here is that it is involved in making judgments about yourself, at least in relation to others, or possibly the other way around, thinking about others in relation to the self as well. So this same region is activated by hearing one's own name relative to other names. So again, just very simple stimuli such as this. But here, there have been a whole lot of other studies looking at fairly arbitrary associations. So in the memory literature, for instance, it's long been known that if you're, for instance, asked to associate words with you or words with somebody else, either that you read words out or you read words out, or you're just given a word like table, me, wall, you, and so on, that you're better at remembering the words that have the word me associated with them. That memory benefit seems to be boosted by activity in this medial prefrontal cortex area. You might just imagine that this is kind of a depth of processing. You're just processing things more elaborately. That isn't the case. If you process things more elaborately, but without referring to yourself, you get another brain network, actually a different part of the frontal lobes, but not this one. So it's something about the me-ness, or that this is a word that just happens in an experimental paradigm to be linked to me rather than somebody else. There's been other tests as well. So for instance, there's a whole literature about why it is that you hear your own name and it kind of pops out and so on. This sort of thing. And the problem with this is that your own name is a very high frequent, high salient thing. So it's impossible to think of a good control condition. There's been a whole set of studies by Glyn Humphreys, who's head of psychology at Oxford, where basically what you do is you take geometric shapes such as circles, squares and triangles, and you label, for instance, the triangle as being me, you label the square as being you, and the circle as being, somebody else, however it may be. And obviously you rotate the design so everybody gets a different shape. What you find is that you're much faster at detecting a shape that has been associated to you in this arbitrary paradigm. You're faster at doing it. It kind of pops out attentively in the same way as, hearing your own name does. Well, not exactly like that, but a very similar mechanism. And again, this kind of attention mechanism depends on this circuit. So it's attending to oneself. Any kind of self-reference, even very arbitrary things, seem to pull in this particular network. And again, here, thinking about one's own emotional response relative to that of a person in a photo, for instance, so you're given a stimulus, you think about how you respond versus others. So this part of the brain seems to be involved in self-referential processing. How do we define this distinction between self and other? Well, a few people have tried to kind of pull it apart and shown that in terms of this particular neural response, it seems to be more to do with closeness, which is obviously more to do with emotional links rather than similarity. So it's not, so obviously in-groups do tend to kind of activate this region more than out-groups, but actually when you pull it apart in terms of whether it's similarity or closeness, you can take individuals, friends for instance, you might be more close to this friend, but actually, at least on a tick list, you're more different to them. And the thing that determines how you kind of pull them in to this neural network is your closeness rather than at least trying to objectify similarity of traits and so on. But again, here, it has a temporal dimension to it as well. So thinking about yourself in the present activates this region, but thinking about yourself in the past doesn't, or at least not in the same way. In this particular study, thinking about yourself in the past is the same as thinking about a stranger, almost. So there's this curious thing here about how you kind of define yourself, both in the moment and also including others as well, that you can kind of get at a little bit with a neural marker that you're probably not going to pick up on questionnaires in at least in a straightforward way. Yeah.
Is there any research on thinking about your future self?
I was wondering that, and I thought that this study did it, but now I'm thinking I'm not sure about this. I think that the future self is going to be more like the present self, would be my guess, because I think that that's what you're kind of taking forward with you. But yes. Yeah, it would be an easy thing to look at, but I'm guessing it wasn't done in this study. Yeah. So this seems to be something that is related to thinking about the self. But I think we shouldn't kind of think of the self as being, a unique thing. Or certainly this brain region isn't just related to the self. It relates to others too, in a curious way. But clearly there are lots of different mechanisms that constitute thinking about the self. This might be kind of a central hub in this network. So there are various models that try to kind of split the self into different kind of cognitive mechanisms. I won't go through all of these in detail, but you can kind of get a gist of it here. So again, when he talks about the ecological self, he's talking about the sense in which the self is me defined by the physical space of my body that I occupy and that I control and so on. This is one aspect of the self. And again, this isn't a very social aspect of the self. And then as you kind of, the extended self, thinking about your self existing over time and so on. But again, this is perhaps challenged by the last piece of evidence there. But there are also more social aspects of the self. So how you think about yourself in terms of others, how you define yourself, socially, in terms of, your group identity. I identify with these people identify with these particular characteristics and so on. That would be part of the self. And this is kind of more conceptual, more socially mediated aspects of the self. Gallagher kind of cuts the chase and says, right, there are just kind of two main components of the self. One is effectively what he calls the minimal self, which is basically all to do with the body, the fact that we have a body that is uniquely ours and that we control it. Other people don't control our actions in our body. So this sense of kind of agency, being in control, and so on, versus kind of everything else, which is the more social things, the more kind of memory things, how we remember ourselves in the past, present, project ourselves in the future, and so on. Again, Gallagher isn't really saying, well, that means that there are two neural networks in the brain, one for this, one for that. Again, he would kind of acknowledge that there would be a multiplicity of mechanisms, but he draws this sharp distinction between these two kinds of processes. This is just one kind of way in which I've tried to kind of map these sorts of differences here. And we can kind of think of them in terms of what those that are kind of more social here, that are very much kind of influenced by your personal history, by your cultural environment. So cultural kind of knowledge, your kind of group membership. So the idea you think of yourself as kind of a collection of different groups. So you're not part of one group, you're part of many groups. Again, your religion, your ethnicity, and so on. So it's kind of almost being at the intersection of lots of Venn diagrams would be one way of thinking about yourself in terms of relation to others. And here, this is something that is probably not going to differ much cross-culturally, is not really defined socially. So this is more Gallagher's kind of sense of a minimal sense around your bodies, the sense in which you control your actions, the sense in which you embody a particular physical space, and so on. And here you've got something that kind of maybe crosses the boundary between them, that is influenced by culture and so on, but is also very much stable over time, not relatively fixed across culture. So the idea that we all have positive self-evaluations on average. Obviously, you can have negative self-esteem, but in general, there's a positive self-bias. This is something that seems to be relatively immune to culture, not necessarily completely immune to experience. So if you experience bad things, you can have a negative self-esteem. But by and large, there's these positive biases and biases for how you remember things and so on. So I'm just going to talk about some of these particular processes and how they've been thought about in the literature. So again, some people have kind of emphasized the role that memory has in kind of constructing the self. And Conway talks about memory both in terms of two different things. So one is kind of storing information about yourself. So he talks about work themes, that time in which I had a job in those years, versus the events that kind of go under them, specific people you know, and so on. That this is kind of part of what it is to be you, what you've done, those kind of events in your life, and so on. So the actual store is kind of half of the story. He also talks about the way in which you kind of construct your memories according to your present self. So in a way, you can only interpret your past events through the kind of the lens of your current self, in a way that you kind of activate these different things in a way that is kind of self-motivating or prioritizes your own current thoughts or your self-esteem. So you always view the past through your present eyes. There's no other way of viewing the past. So you've got these two different things. One is your store, and one is the kind of lens which is skewed by the present information, if you will. I'll come to some evidence that we have these kind of biases in how we interrogate memory. Ledoux also he's published a book called The Synaptic Self. So Ledoux is kind of hardcore neuroscientist working on the amygdala and so on. But he's got this book effectively saying that the self is effectively reducible to synaptic connections in the brain. This is what makes you unique, your own particular collections of pattern of synaptic connections. And to some extent that's true, but it doesn't really kind of buy you much in terms of the general literature. What's special about the medial prefrontal cortex? Ledoux hasn't really got anything to say about that by thinking about, the self in this way, or other kinds of aspects of the self that are crucial. So whilst there's some truth in this, I'm not clear that it gives you really, amazing insight into what the self is. So kind of consistent with this view is the idea that we remember the past in terms of current knowledge and beliefs. So here, this is an interesting study, kind of quite rare in the literature, and that you've got a longitudinal study in which people were asked their personal beliefs about politics and other things in 2 different time periods. And what people are asked to do is asked to say what they think now and what they thought 10 years ago. But here you've got some objective measure to know what they thought 10 years ago. And basically people tend to kind of distort what they thought previously to be more in line with what they think now. So again, it's this idea that you might have a memory store, but you can only interrogate that memory store based on your current cues, your current kind of self-motive, and so on. And again, this kind of task is obviously, using your medial prefrontal cortex to kind of, bias your memory retrieval and so on according to your current self. But also you tend to remember the past in a more self-enhancing manner. So those who identify strongly with an in-group are worse at remembering acts of historical violence by their in-group. And self-enhancing memories are judged to feel more recent. So they're kind of almost more connected to the present self than the past self. You kind of distort things in time. If things are good things about you, they kind of are judged to have occurred more recently. So the interesting thing from a more social perspective is how we kind of construe the self in relation to groups and cultural knowledge. So we can think of our social identity, we can think of social identity as just being one facet of the self within these kind of larger models, as being really a collection of different group memberships. So your nationality, your race, your religion, your political allegiances, and so on. So everybody is a member of multiple groups. You're not just a member of one group. And basically, as with kind of retrieving things from memory, it's almost as if which group you belong to depends on your current mindset, your current state of mind. So again, these are various studies here in which, for instance, to give the first example, Asian women view their maths ability more favourably when their ethnic identity is highlighted relative to when their gender is highlighted. So again, here what you've got is people who are just asked to judge their maths. So the stereotype here is that there are 2 stereotypes. One is that women are bad at maths, and one is that Asian people are good at maths. Okay? So if an Asian woman is asked to judge her maths ability, but she's asked to think about her Asianness, that she judges her maths as being better, whereas if she's asked to think about her gender, then her maths ability is judged less favourably. So again, as with memory, you kind of construe yourself through the lens of your current kind of way of thinking as you're primed. So again, white women show evidence of a more negative attitude towards black women when race is highlighted than when gender is highlighted. So again, here, when gender is highlighted, it's kind of all sisters together. When race is highlighted, then, the things become quite different. So obviously, these are just kind of questionnaire measures, fairly arbitrary things, but you could show with neuroscience measures that these kinds of things matter. They also kind of matter when you're thinking about your experimental designs as well. So typically, I tend not to do experiments on race and things like this, but typically people ask for demographic information at the start of an experiment, whereas actually there's a lot of evidence that maybe you do it at the end, unless you're actually wanting to prime people to kind of behave according to their stereotype, gender and age and so on. These effects are quite small, by the way. I don't think they're huge effect sizes, but they are there, they exist. And there have been other kind of more objective measures, such as intelligence as well. And people will score low on an intelligence measure when a negative kind of stereotype is primed of them. Obviously, it's not a huge drop, and here it's probably more around their motivation levels than other things. It's not entirely clear what that mechanism would be, but there are studies along these lines. So although I kind of concept of the self is kind of fluid depending on what's currently primed or in our working memory or is kind of contextually relevant, There's also a sense in which you think about yourself as relatively stable over time that is also very culturally specified. So the most striking distinction that's received the most amount of study here is this notion between interdependent versus independent self. And again, the prototypical example of the interdependent self would be East Asian countries, although there are a lot of others. And the prototypical examples of the independent self would be the West. And this is obviously related to collectivism and individualism. So these concepts here are kind of self-construal concepts, whereas here these are more kind of rules about how groups work. So collectivist cultures or the interdependent self means that you think about yourself in terms of your obligations and your role within the community and your family and your society. So it's more about thinking about your own needs and your own attitudes in relation to others is how you would think about that. So themselves as part of the network of it, and satisfying the group's needs rather than your own needs would be the one way of thinking about it. Individualism is obviously go away, make your own mark on the world, flee the nest kind of attitude that we would kind of have in the West, go and do something different. Your parents don't, feel that you've got to follow in their footsteps. This kind of approach would be that you're kind of trying to define yourself in terms of your uniqueness, in terms of what makes you you, that may or may not be connected so much with the family. What's kind of interesting about this is that there's a lot of evidence that these ways of thinking affects lots of changes, both perceptually as well as when thinking about social things. So these particularly kind of cultural niches don't just affect the social mechanisms in the brain, they seem to affect other aspects of functioning. So for instance, there's whole things about kind of local and global processing that are biased depending on which kind of culture you come from. But in, for instance, fMRI studies, if you've got a complex scene in which you've got objects and backgrounds, people from Western societies they move their eyes more to the object, and people with interdependent selves, kind of more collectivist, focus more on the background and the context, both in terms of eye movements, but in terms of how the brain is activated by objects versus scenes. So there are separate parts of the brain that deal with kind of large-scale scenes and that are involved in recognizing objects. So you can look at the relative amount of weighting in these different kind of networks, if you will. So that, again, you can look at it both across cultures, but you can also look at it within cultures, just priming different ways of thinking about yourself. So there's a whole set of studies in which essentially what you're given is a narrative to read. And the narrative says, I did this, I did that. Or the narrative said, we did this, we did that, whatever. And that's all you're doing. You just read a narrative in which the word I or we is substituted. So you can do it either as a between subject design or potentially as a within subject design. And this is kind of one of the classic kind of cognitive psychology experiments about local and global processing, seeing the woods or the trees. So is that an H or is it a letter A? Clearly it's both. What you generally find is that most people have a global bias, and this is kind of what grabs your attention, but the amount of global bias would change over time, or depending on the context and so on. So here, this is just within Chinese participants, but when they read the word, so independent is I, they favour the A interpretation. They're faster at detecting the presence of an A. When they read the we, they're faster at detecting the H. So the task here is just say whether there's an A present for in this, and sometimes the A is the global shape, sometimes the A is the local shape, or whatever, and you just say, is there an A there? That would be the standard kind of task here. And here, this is the measure of the reaction time there. So again, this kind of social priming seems to have effects on how you kind of see the world or attend to objects within the world and the relationship between them. And again, these differences occur early, so again, they really are happening in what we would think of as being perceptual parts of the brain. So 100 milliseconds is within the kind of visual processing stream here. So although the effects are social, they really are happening or changing the way that you see things. So again, you've got stable effects, and you've also got your current kind of lens in which you think about yourself at any given moment in time, and both of these factors are important. So let's go back to the medial prefrontal cortex, and there's been a whole kind of set of studies that compare typically Chinese and American participants. So this would be interdependent self, more collectivist thinking, versus independent self. And this is the original study by Kelly et al. Presenting trait descriptions where you think of a trait in relation to yourself, or you think of the trait in relationship to your mother, or in relationship to, say, a stranger or a famous person who you don't personally know. What Chinese people do when they're thinking about themselves, both Chinese and Americans activate their medial prefrontal cortex. So this is the evidence I've already talked about at the beginning about self-referential processing. What's interesting is that the Chinese also seem to activate this a lot more for their mother than the mother and the self are much similar. So, whereas in the Americans, there is a difference. Again, the mother is different from the other. So you've got, it's not an absolute difference here, there is a trend, but nevertheless, you've got these differences there. So the idea is that, you know, within these collectivist cultures, the mother is part of the self-concept a lot more than independent cultures in which you're encouraged to leave the nest and, you know, be independent from your family and so on. This is one of the claims, but obviously here there's it's a modulation rather than an absolute effect that you get. And again, they've done it for other things. So within collectivist cultures, it really is greater for the mother. The mother seems to have more of a special role than the father, and the father than the best friend. So you've got these kind of degrees of kind of closeness. So in general, people activate their medial prefrontal cortex more for close people, but how you define who's close can be partly culturally set, in effect, that you can define your family as being, yeah, that really is part of you and your kind of things in a way that other cultures don't. And again, so you've got this kind of interaction between stable ways of thinking about yourself, but also thinking about yourself right now. So collectivists activate this region more when thinking about themselves in relation to others, but individualists activate it more when thinking about themselves per se. So it's almost if collectivists have the greatest self-concept when they think about themselves in relation to others, whereas for individuals, just thinking about themselves is enough to do this. The relationship with others is kind of irrelevant for that modulation of this network. So there's an element of dynamism as well. So again, there are some cross-cultural research here suggesting that this kind of pattern of self-related activity flips depending on whether you're thinking of yourself, you know, in terms of your status as being you know, part of an Asian subculture within America, or whether you're thinking of yourself as being an American, for instance. Okay, right, so how we didn't have time. Any kind of questions about this before I go on? Okay. So if we go on to talk about groups, so groups and categories really are, again, this is part of what it is that defines yourself. So this is why the self and kind of groups tend to be a meaningful kind of way of thinking about these things, both in social psychology and in social neuroscience. Again, when we talk about how social information is represented in the brain, we can think of it kind of similar to this sort of thing, in terms of network of attributes and associations and so on that you develop as a result of your interactions with the world, your interactions with various people. And the idea is that what you're doing is that there is at least some tendency to think about people not as individuals but as members of a group. Again, this is very contextually specific, but the idea is that this is part of how the cognitive system works, is that basically what you're trying to do is to simplify information processing. You're looking for commonalities, for statistical trends, and so on, that enable you to make inferences or knowledge about people, particularly in unfamiliar situations. So the idea is if you meet somebody, that you should be able to make inferences about them that may be, at least on average, more likely to be true than false. Okay? But on any individual occasion, there's a huge amount of variability. But basically, the brain tries to form generalizations and so on, and this is a good thing. Obviously, the problem is when you apply those generalizations to each and every case, or you make kind of invalid assumptions and inferences based on them. So there's kind of this paradox between a good or kind of efficient way of processing information and extending that too broadly or making false assumptions based on it with it. So it's an efficient way of sourcing information, but it's also a source of bias and generalization. There are various ways of thinking about this as well. So if we start with in-group favoritism, the question is, where does in-group favoritism come from? So one common idea in the literature is that basically in-group favoritism is essentially geared around the notion of self-esteem, so that most people tend to hold themselves in a net positive regard. This is, generally true, and therefore if you hold yourself in positive net regard, you are more likely to hold other people who are close to you or who share your values, who are similar to you. So that's the basic kind of theory put forward by Greenwald et al. It's almost kind of like a spreading activation kind of model, that you think of yourself positively, others who are kind of part of your self-concept or who are like you kind of benefit from that positive regard. Okay? And again, there's evidence for in-group favoritism. So there is kind of more cooperation on the prisoner's dilemma when you're playing with an in-group versus an out-group. I'd have to remember how this is looked at. It's either defined by race, or sometimes it's actually done in relatively arbitrary ways, that you just assign people into Team A, Team B, and things like this. And that's often enough to get these biases. Also, this in-group bias can be quite implicit or unconscious as well. So some evidence for this comes from the so-called name-letter effect, which is basically that I can give you all 26 letters of the alphabet and just ask you how much you like each letter. And people tend to like the letters in their name, but they're not necessarily aware of why that is. If you ask them how they did the task, they tend not to give you a particular answer for that.
Is that because they don't want to, or they generally don't know?
They don't know?
They don't know why they choose these letters, or whether they just don't want to tell you.
Well, I'm not sure what the answer they give, but they tend... Well, that's a good point, yeah. But there is evidence that actually it influences their behaviour as well. So I suspect... Yeah, just asking people why they do it. There might be good reasons why they don't want to admit to liking themselves or liking their name. So I take that point, and I think that's a good one. But actually, there's other evidence that actually the effects are so subtle that it's hard to believe that this is what's happening. So here, these are hurricanes in America. So we've got Hurricane Charlie, Hurricane Francis, Hurricane Ivan, and so on. What you've effectively got here, so here these are the amount of donations to Hurricane Charlie by people whose name begins with the letter C. So imagine that you're called Catherine, for instance, spelt with a C. What the purple bar here is how likely it is that somebody with a name beginning with C is likely to donate to a hurricane, any hurricane. This is how likely they were to donate to Hurricane Charlie when it shares the first letter of their name. Okay? And you get the same effect for all of them. The only reason why you've got more donation for what seems like for Charlie than Francis is simply that there are more people with a name beginning with C than F. Okay, so it's not that Hurricane Charlie actually got more donations, because this is the amount of donations to people with that letter in their name. Okay, so all that matters here for your interpretation of this is the difference between the green bar and the purple bar. But basically, if your letter, if you're called something beginning with the letter W, you're more likely to donate more to a hurricane beginning with the letter W than to other hurricanes. That's the truth. These effects are quite small, but they are there. And it's very hard to imagine that that is a conscious judgment that people are making, but we could have that debate if you want. There are other effects. So there's a study called Denise the Dentist from Denver as well, which is exactly what it sounds. That if you're called Denise, you are statistically more likely to live in Denver and statistically more likely to choose a dentist as an occupation. Now, you can imagine how small these effects might be, but they are statistically significant. And obviously, as soon as you look at them at a population level, they may be meaningful, but they are there. So people kind of gravitate to these kind of bizarre things more often than by chance. And you can look at this, again, neuroscientifically using various paradigms. So this is an approach that I think is really quite exciting and gets at a good way of kind of using neuroscience to tackle some of these questions. So one of the whole problems that you've got in thinking about in-groups versus out-groups is that it's so conflated by so many experimental variables. So you've got a lot more exposure to in-groups and out-groups and so on. There are just so many things that you just can't control for. This is a paradigm that was developed in social psychology that's been used quite a lot in social neuroscience, called the minimal group paradigm. And all it is that you take a group of people, your team A, your team B, your team A, your team B. This is all you do. You're the red team, you're the blue team. You're fantastic, you're amazing. This is what you do, okay? You literally just divide people into two groups, and they would kind of learn who's in each group, or they're just shown a series of faces on a computer screen. What you find is that people have better memory for in-groups, so all they've done is that they're shown a series of faces with their group membership under it, so Team A, Team B. You know whether you're Team A or Team B. You're better at remembering those who are in your team than those who are in the out team. So this is kind of paralleling a whole other literature showing that people are good at remembering people from their own race more than other races and so on. But again, that's interesting, but it can be conflated by the fact you've got more expertise with your own race than other faces. But you get exactly the same effect with arbitrary associations, and it affects the way that the brain responds. So when you're processing your in-group, you have more activity in your fusiform face area. Here, this is an in-group favoritism effects. You don't have it lowered for the out-group. So here, obviously, there's a third group who you don't know what team they're in, for instance. So Team A, Team B, and unclassified, for instance. So this is a contrast in the favour of boosting the in-group rather than out-group negativity. But we'll come to race in a bit, and you do get the opposite with that. And also evidence you get more holistic processing of in-group faces. So this fusiform face area is more about kind of individuating faces rather than kind of social categorization. If you think about it, it's what helps you to kind of recognize individuals and so on. So the fact that you've got this kind of sharpening of this response for your in-group, again, might be a subtle kind of neuroscientific bias as to why in-groups are individuals and out-groups are that category. They're not individuals, they're all that lot, or whatever they may be. Yeah. But this actually affects things at quite a low level in the visual system, these kind of social categories. And obviously it isn't hardwired, it's to do with context modulation of vision and so on. So if we like our in-group, why don't we like our out-group? There's a whole kind of class of theories that seem to suggest that disliking an out-group is just a natural consequence of liking your in-group. I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that that probably isn't the case, that there are a whole lot of reasons as to why you might dislike an out-group, and that has nothing to do with the in-group favouritism. There are probably somewhat separate effects for these two. And again, you can see some of the evidence coming out for this is that some of the things that boost your processing of an in-group don't necessarily have detrimental effects on the out-group. And you can get the reverse thing here, that some of the things that reduce the out-group don't necessarily enhance the in-group. So you often have an asymmetry between them. So, again, so prejudice basically here is an extreme form of obviously out-group negativity. And it's specifically defined about disliking or negative attitudes based on group membership per se. Okay? So it's not about I dislike that person as an individual. It's although that might be the way that it's expressed, it's something about their group membership that is important for the definition of prejudice. Okay? So there's a whole host of problems around how you measure prejudice. And in a way, I think one of the interesting things about social neuroscience is that it offers a new way of kind of thinking about that. Obviously, the new way of thinking about it is only as good as the measures themselves. I don't think it solves all the problems, but it at least kind of enables you to look at the problem from a new perspective that generates new insights. So again, here there are various explicit measures of racism that are basically questionnaires. So this is what's called the modern racism scale. And by modern racism, what they mean by this is not necessarily saying, I dislike black people, but it's about, for instance, coming out with these kinds of statements. If blacks would only just try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. So again, it's not a very overt form of racism, but it's something, there's a negativity about this. So this is one of the other ones. But again, there's a big problem with these measures, and that's the social desirability bias. The good thing about these measures is that it's clearly measuring something that we would be happy to say is prejudice, in the sense that this is very clearly about group membership. And as soon as you start looking in the brain or start looking at implicit measures, then you're getting away from the social desirability bias, so that's a big tick for these kinds of measures. But the problem there is, are you really measuring prejudice, or are you just measuring, for instance, expertise, the fact that you've got more knowledge of your own group than other races and so on? What is it that these measures are tapping? And that's the real kind of paradox between which of these kind of measures we think works. So there's been because of the social desirability bias that we have, there's been a whole kind of effort to try and find other kinds of measures that would detect racism without having people endorse these attitudes. So again, if we look at measures of muscular activity, so EMG is electromyography, so it's a bit like EEG, but whereas EEG is measuring brain signals, EMG is measuring muscular signals, so nerves going into the muscles on the face. And here what you're looking at would be kind of smiley muscles and frowny muscles. So your frowny muscles are here, smiley muscles kind of mouth and eyes and so on. And what you find here is that when white people are interacting with black people, they show more kind of frowns on this sort of behaviour measure, but they say, I really enjoyed working with that person. And in fact, white people claim to enjoy working with black people more than the white people on this. So, but in fact, they frown more when they're working with the black person than the white person. So that's kind of interesting. It suggests that there is something going on in this measure. But would we want to conclude that that person's prejudiced from it? I don't know. We can debate that. I would say that most measures of social neuroscience are implicit. So again, this is measuring the brain, but this is in effect, you're looking at the brain state independently of what people think, or it's an independent measure that you can corroborate with what people think. So for me, fMRI measures of race, prejudice, and so on are effectively within this kind of implicit measure. And there's a famous test called the implicit association test, which I'm guessing many of you have heard about. So what I'll do is I'll show you this test, and then I'll stop to have a bit of discussion around it.
But is it possible that virtually all of us have a hidden racial bias, hidden even from ourselves? Several years ago, Dateline brought together two groups of volunteers, African American and white, who agreed to take a test scientifically designed to answer just that question.
Here's how it works. These words and faces appear rapidly, one after another, around the screen. The test taker is supposed to link one to the left or right box here in the center, linking positive words like friend to good, negative words like awful to bad, white faces with white, black faces with black. And it's the mistakes that are so revealing.
We find that frequently. Some people are disturbed by the results. Ready? Go.
Dateline put this experiment to a difficult challenge, testing a cross-section of men and women, including some who have impeccable credentials in race relations. People like Rhonda, a civil rights attorney.
Okay, here it is.
During the first half of the test, black is linked to bad, and white is linked to good.
Right.
For Rhonda, this half of the test is a breeze. She never makes a mistake.
Okay, very good. Now, we'll give you the other one.
But let's see how she does when the information is reversed, when the left box, marked bad, has a white face, and the right box, labeled good, has a black face.
Left.
Suddenly the test becomes much more difficult for Rhonda. About a third of the way through, she makes a mistake, linking the white face to the right box, even though that shows a black face.
I lost it.
Rhonda's score indicates a strong preference for white. Is this because she unconsciously associates white with good?
Well, I could tell when I was taking it, I had so much of an easier time doing the white with good, much to my dismay.
We all might be prejudiced in ways we're not aware. So
Mazen Banaji of Harvard University and Anthony Greenwald of the University of Washington created this test.
what do you think this test reveals that perhaps we didn't know before? How fair are we being when we judge a person?
Okay.
Betsy, an events planner, had similar results.
Left, right.
Once again, on the part of the test which associates black with good and white with bad, a white test taker flounders.
We had you all together almost to the end.
Betsy's test shows a preference for white.
There would be many people who would say, what's wrong with showing a preference for your own race?
In some contexts, it's actually illegal to do so. In employment contexts, in college admissions.
But what does all this prove?
Okay, well, yeah, that's a good ending point. So just so you're clear, there are various ways in which this is set up. You can do it with one of the original versions, use people's names or use faces. The key thing is that you've got two buttons and you're making categorical judgments. So here you're making a judgment whether this is a stereotypically kind of white or black name. So here we say that it's a white name here. This is a black name there. But at the same time, you've got two types of judgments. So in some cases, you're also shown kind of negative words, and you have to judge whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. What you find is that basically when you pair black names or faces with unpleasant and white with pleasant, so this is congruent, and I should put that in kind of congruent with kind of racial stereotypes, at least in America. What you find is that people are much faster at categorizing the word murder when it is when you have to press the same button that you're pressing for categorizing black faces. But when you're having to categorize murder on the same button as with white, then you're slower. And basically what the implicit association test is a measure in milliseconds of the difference between this block and that block. And typically you get effects maybe of 200 milliseconds here, showing a white kind of favoritism in effect. So what I'll get you to do is to talk about some of these issues So these are the results of the Phelps et al. Study. So here you've got the amygdala activity for, hang on, it goes the other way around. So this is the amygdala activity here, and this is the IAT effects in milliseconds there, okay? Yeah, so the more amygdala activity you get, the more kind of the stronger your IAT is. So these are all white participants, so there are individual differences there. So for instance, this person here shows very small effects on the IAT and no kind of differential activity of the amygdala. This one here is the modern racism scale. So these are explicit endorsements of kind of racist attitudes that black people could do well if they only worked harder, this sort of thing. There's no correlation there. So whatever the IAT is picking up on, it is measuring something of interest within the social brain. Now what that is, we could debate, but I'm not aware of any kinds of studies that pick out many meaningful things on these explicit measures. So there is something about the IAT. I don't think we can dismiss it. But yes, it may, nor should I think we need to rush and say that this is evidence of prejudice. So the other key thing that wasn't done in the Phelps et al. Study is that obviously these are white people looking at black and white faces. So there was one other study done in the same year which did have black and white participants looking at black and white faces. Unfortunately, what they did is that they didn't analyse the black and white participants separately. What they did is that they looked at in-groups versus out-groups. So that would be black people looking at black faces, white people looking at white faces, and treating them as one group, for instance. So that's... So that again, they do get amygdala activity here. That basically your amygdala activity kind of stays at a higher level when looking at out-group members. But again, without differentiating between these, you're not kind of getting to the heart of what's going on. So I'll come back to this in a bit as to how to interpret this. But just to say something more about the IAT. So in its favour, the good thing about it is that it's a very simple test, and it's not just used for race. There's a whole host of other ones, and you can download them online and kind of run them on people. They're kind of freely available tests that you can do. So you can do it for nationality, politics, gender stereotypes, young and old, all kinds of things. There's so many tests that are out there. And the sample sizes are phenomenal. So the people who you saw interviewed there, they've got tens of thousands of data points for this that they correlate with absolutely everything. It does correlate with self-report measures of racism, but the effects are small. So a correlation of plus 0.2 is, you're going to need a large sample size to get that significant at p 0.01. But it is there, but it's weak. It's also, again, what is it sensitive to? It's kind of not just sensitive to long-term attitudes, because again, as with the amygdala signal, the IAT score itself is reduced if you're kind of presented with well-liked black personalities and so on. There's some evidence that it's a better predictor of behavioural reactions with an out-group member, and by better than kind of questionnaire measures where you're explicitly endorsing kind of racist statements. And also kind of biases, hiring recommendations, pro-social behaviour and so on. So there is evidence that it does actually affect things, but that doesn't get to the heart of what the mechanism of this is. And again, this is some of the key evidence that suggests that it is around at least socio-cultural stereotypes, because it's not abolished in black Americans. It's not reversed this. So what do we in terms of the brain processing of rate, what are we kind of concluding about this? So what we're kind of being tempted with is the idea that the amygdala is some kind of representing outgroup fear and prejudice. Is that what we've kind of got here? Well, maybe not, because you don't get it with well-liked black faces. The other thing that Phelps et al. Did is that there's this effect around startle. So basically what this is that if you're startled, that will activate your amygdala, okay? But if you do this at the same time as seeing something threatening, like a snake, it will increase your startle and your kind of amygdala response. And basically what you find is that you would get the same kind of effect by showing a black face whilst having a loud kind of unexpected sound. That the black face will effectively boost your kind of startle response with this in the same way as seeing something like a gun or a snake or something kind of unpleasant. Again, typically in white people. But this is interesting here in that, again, most of these studies are comparing black and white, but they had an Asian group here who to a white participant is an out group, but doesn't have the same negative socio-cultural stereotypes associated with them. So Modio et al. Showed that the startle response is greater to a kind of a bang or something with a black face, but not to an Asian face or white face. So it's not necessarily these effects aren't all about outgroups. It's about what you make of the outgroup. So being an outgroup in itself is not enough. You might know kind of individuals in that outgroup and that will block the response. You might see other outgroups such as Asians who in America don't have the same negative stereotypes, and you get somewhat different patterns there. Again, as with the IAT, interestingly, when finally, after 5 years after the Phelps, you have the correct kind of experimental design where you've got black people looking at black and white faces, and lo and behold, black people also get some amygdala activity when looking at black faces as well. So they show some of the same effects. So again, the suggestion here is that this is around kind of violent stereotypes, negative socio-cultural stereotypes, rather than prejudice per se. So again, we can learn a lot about prejudice by using these kinds of methods, but I think there's a real danger in kind of equating these measures with prejudice. It's just enabling us to kind of look at the more subtleties that underpin this. So again, this is a developmental study as well, showing that this, presumably on white children, showing that the amygdala activity emerges during adolescence and isn't present in childhood. So the effect that Phelps reported, it kind of emerges. It isn't there early on with this. So in a way, I think that the amygdala activity is interesting. It might be processing something related to threat and socio-cultural stereotypes, but it isn't necessarily a kind of an outgroup neural signature in the way that it was perhaps originally thought. And it probably might reflect more kind of social understanding of groups rather than your individual orientation, in the same way as the social rights activist shows some of the same behavioural profile. I think one of the other interesting things that's kind of emerged out of the social neuroscience literature, aside from this kind of tricky debate around the amygdala, is around kind of the control of prejudice. So given that everybody has these kind of negative social stereotypes kind of in our semantic knowledge, in effect, whether or not we believe them, the question is why do some people act on them and others don't? What are the kind of mechanisms around that? And I think that this is probably the key kind of information about what prejudice is how you act on information rather than the actual storage of the information itself, which is probably what you're picking up on here and in the other measures. So knowing about stereotypes and prejudice but not acting on them might require greater online control. So again, taking from the social psychology literature and applying it to more neuroscience paradigms is this kind of distinction here. So this is a kind of questionnaire measure where they ask people why they, well, let's read them out. So I attempt to act in non-prejudiced ways towards black people because it is personally important to me. I attempt to appear non-prejudiced towards black people in order to avoid disapproval from others. Okay? So you've got here both of these, well, certainly this one here we would happily say is non-prejudiced. This person here is a little bit more ambiguous. Okay, they're trying not to be prejudiced, but actually their motivations for doing so is more around social disapproval, about being PC. There's something about this that is somewhat ambiguous as to why they are not wanting to reduce the prejudice. Okay. And people will differ in the amount in which they endorse these kinds of statements. And obviously it isn't just two of them, there's a whole set of them. So you can categorize people according to this way. So one of the things that you find here is that, that these kinds of internal motivations that here are associated with lower IAT scores there. So with this, whereas this, so this does distinguish on this kind of implicit measure. So again here, the IAT score probably isn't just about, storing things. It's a combination of other things, including your own motivation for wanting to avoid prejudiced outcomes, whether it's kind of out of personal belief or kind of conforming. And interestingly, again, using this kind of more neuroscientific measure of the startle response, is that those who report these kind of internal motivations show a much lower startle response to black faces here. So what's the kind of neural mechanism for controlling prejudice? So as with most cognitive control, obviously this is your kind of frontal network involved in emotion regulation. And here this is also looking at, well, I'll talk about this, an EEG signature as well. So if you do fMRI of the IAT test, so remember that the Phelps study didn't do fMRI of the IAT test. In the Phelps study, all that happens is you see black faces, you see white faces, black faces, white faces. You see what's happening in the brain. Then outside of the scanner, they do this IAT test. Okay, so that's a different kind of paradigm. Imagine doing the IAT test in the scanner. Now you can look at the congruent trials and the incongruent trials as different kinds of events within the imaging environment. Okay, and directly contrast them. So that's the kind of thing that others have done here. Kind of in parallel to looking at faces, per se. What you find here is that basically when you're looking at these incongruent trials, you've got a lot of activity within your kind of emotion regulation network, your lateral prefrontal cortex, and also this region called the anterior cingulate, which is involved in kind of conflict resolution, so avoiding errors. So the classic example of a task that activates anterior cingulate is the colour Stroop task, where you're asked to name the colour of the ink and avoid the colour of the word. This is what activates the anterior cingulate, but you get it when you're making these social, racial kinds of association confounds as well. And you also get it in EEG measures. So this is ERPs. So event-related potential. So this measures the time course of activity. What you find here is that, that there is a particular neural signature called the event-related negativity. So when you make an error on something here, you get this particular boost in electrical signal. And and this particular paradigm is a bit like the IAT, in that basically what you have to do is to categorize objects as either being weapons or tools. And as with the IAT, what you find is that you're faster at detecting a gun after it's come after a black face than a white face, and faster at detecting a tool after it's come from a white face than a black face. You've got these associations here, and you can also see this particular thing there. So you've got the largest error-related negativity when you've got things that don't, for the black and the tool here, as opposed to the black and the gun, which is the more stereotypical association. What's going on here? The interesting thing about this is that in this particular study, they also showed that one aspect of this, it's actually a later part of the waveform, also separates according to where, you can't see it in this graph, but it also separates according to whether people have internal motivations for avoiding prejudice or more kind of social conformity motivations. So you can see it here in this kind of detecting these kind of biases in the experiment show up in these particular signals to do with emotion regulation. So how can we kind of pull this together in terms of evidence of, sorry, I've just seen where this lecture's going. In terms of racial processing in the brain? What I think that we have is kind of a network of regions that detect and are involved in processing of racial outgroups. And this is one model that was published in a Nature Reviews paper. So the idea here is that you've got three different kinds of network. You've got one network which is involved in kind of racial identification or categorization of race, which is basically your fusiform-based processes. So again, social categorization, but also involved in kind of individuating individual members of a race, whether or not you treat people as an individual or a category, social category will modulate activity in this region, as well as looking at different races. So this is involved in kind of the more perceptual aspects of race, but also around kind of categorization versus individuation of faces and other people here. And then the idea is that you've probably got a semantic network that is involved in kind of storing racial stereotypes, probably in your temporal lobes, but the amygdala is particularly representing negative or kind of emotional connotations associated with racial groups. So what they've put here as race-based evaluations. Okay? And then you've got another network here that involves your kind of lateral prefrontal cortex and your anterior cingulate, which kind of work in concert with each other. One involved in kind of monitoring for racial bias, and the other in kind of regulating racial bias, holding in mind your beliefs, your kind of your values, and so on, or trying to avoid acting on your negative evaluations, which to some extent you can't avoid having because they're just part of your social knowledge of you know how the world is, even if it's not true or it's a gross generalization. You still store that information in your heads. So I think that this is kind of a nice way of thinking about this, and it goes away from maybe the early literature and the early 2000s, thinking that, you know, the amygdala is kind of some kind of readout for race, and you're kind of thinking about this more in terms of a network of regions where, you know, to some extent you're processing people as individuals, you've got semantic biases, but you've also got your, in inverted commas, your free will, your kind of your beliefs, your willingness to act on your evaluations or not. Any kind of questions about this?
I was just wondering, if it's like a network involved in sort of determining like race and outgroup sort of things, would in the period of time where these sort of things would have developed over like evolutionary time, would sort of outgroup membership not be more ambiguous anyway?
Well, that's exactly right. So yes, that's right. So I think that that's exactly right. And in fact, the interesting thing about race is that, you know, what is it? You know, skin color. It's a continuous thing, not a categorical thing anyway. So basically what you're effectively doing is you're imposing categories onto something, and that's something that obviously would have happened in the past where, you know, imagine that you were living in Asia, you're going to be at war with your next tribe, but they're going to look just like you, in effect. They're not going to look that much different. And that this would be the kind of mechanism that you would have here. So I think that that's entirely right. about this. And I think that that's why things like this minimal group paradigm, that you just say your team A, your team B, or whatever, you effectively get the same kind of thing, except you won't get you don't necessarily get a strong amygdala activation in this minimal outgroup, because there's nothing necessarily bad about the other group. You have to kind of learn that, but you will learn that because, if you're in a competitive situation where everyone's fighting for resources, they will, the chances are that there is a good motivation for, wanting to keep things for yourself. But you're right, in terms of the evolutionary pressures, it's not about skin colour at all. It's about categorisation. Yeah. Okay, thanks. So we'll see you next week.